Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this film? Because in our democratic society, we claim to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Yet those freedoms are seldom realized by children and young people who are born and raised into a belief system where they're indoctrinated with fear of the end of the world or Armageddon, like I was. Fortunately, I was able to figure it out at an early age, in my early 20s, and I moved on. But many do not. The end results of this type of belief system can be lifelong social handicaps, such as emotional, psychological, and spiritual difficulties, as well as anxiety disorders, depressions, and even suicide. So it's a very serious issue. Our intent is to produce a powerful and thought-provoking film that brings these issues to light and promotes healing through love and through knowledge and awareness of the issues. And knowledge is really the key to empowering an individual to make wise choices in their life. And many of those who grow up like this don't have these choices. In this first of a series of interview tapes, James Penton gives us great insight into his own personal life story, and as a professional historian, into the authoritarian and totalitarian nature of some belief systems and the negative effect they can have on the individual. We want to thank everyone for having purchased this tape, and we welcome anyone to check out our website for continued updates on what is happening with the project. And we thank you for your continued support. And without the support of the viewers and those who have purchased this tape, this project would not be happening. So thank you very much.
Well, I was taught that everyone who was not a member of our particular religious sect was going to be destroyed shortly at Armageddon. And of course, this was in the first years of World War II. It was pretty frightening because at that time we were under ban in Canada, and I was taught a great deal of contempt and hatred for the Catholic Church. And it took me years to realize that when Catholics took their shoes and socks off at night, that they didn't have hooves rather than feet like the rest of us did. And so we had a very jaundiced view of the rest of the world, the rest of society, felt very persecuted. But fortunately, my grandmother, who had been a member of our community during most of the century, nonetheless had a much kindlier view. She never accepted the idea that everyone who didn't go along with our particular sect's teachings would be destroyed at Armageddon. I remember she telling me one time that the head of the Watchtower Society, Judge Rutherford, came to the conclusion that Adam wouldn't have a resurrection. And my grandmother said, well, I don't know whether Adam will have a resurrection or not. I don't think anybody else does, but I'll tell you this, if he has a resurrection, I want to be there to greet him. So she had a much sunnier view, and I thank God for that because it helped me growing up. I think that growing up in a small and extremely narrow community such as that, with a feeling of constant persecution, caused a lot of alienation with the rest of society. And I remember as a boy the police coming to my parents' home here in Canada, and if we had had a copy of the King James Version of the Bible in the house that was published by the Watchtower Society, my father could have been sent to prison for it. You know, it was all right to have copies of Mein Kampf on library shelves throughout the country, but it was wrong to have a copy of the King James Bible published by this particular religious organization, Jehovah's Witnesses. I felt a certain amount of distance. I played with the other kids in a normal fashion, I guess, and we played cops and robbers and so forth. But I felt a real sense of alienation, particularly over the whole issue of singing the national anthem and the flag salutes and so forth. Sometimes I did it, and then my conscience bothered me terribly, and other times I wouldn't do it. And actually, the teachers never attempted to force me because I was living in Saskatchewan, where the provincial government said not to force anybody. Nonetheless, there was tremendous peer pressure, and you grow up with a sense of, well, it's the world against us and us against the world. And you either become very quiet and subdued, or you become a bit thorny. And I think I became a little bit thorny. What the situation was with me was that because there was a ban on Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada from 1941 to 1943, we really didn't attend meetings because, first of all, there was the ban, and second, we were so far away from meetings. And as a consequence, I grew up kind of halfway within the community and halfway out of it and associated with other kids. And for a time when I was a teenager, I became quite interested in politics and became a member of the CCYM, which was the CCF youth movement, the ancestors of the present NDP in Canada. And then when I became a committed Jehovah's Witness at, I guess 15 or 16, I cut all those associations off and became, for a time, very active as a witness. And I think I must have been rather a bit of a pain to some of my relatives who weren't witnesses, because what happens is that when you think you have the truth with a capital T, you become more than a little bit of a pain in the neck. You become incredibly self-righteous. And I think that that's what happened to me. And you become outspoken, defensive. I think what happened to me is what has happened to a great many Jewish people. A great many Jewish people are either very quiet, very submissive, very polite, or they become brassy as the Dickens because they have to survive. And I think the same thing happened within my own sectarian community, Jehovah's Witnesses. You either became very submissive and very dominated, or you became an extrovert and a bit brassy in order to survive. And I think that there is a tremendous parallel between the way many of the Jehovah's Witnesses acted and many Jewish people act, and for precisely the same reasons. When you have pressure from the outward society, it does all sorts of bad things to you. Unfortunately, unlike Jewish people, there was a stigma insofar as education was concerned, and most Jehovah's Witnesses didn't get the education which has been a salvation to many Jewish people. But I was an exception because, again, my grandparents and parents had a great deal of respect for education and were much more liberal than most people within the community, and as a consequence, I was able to go on and get that education. My grandmother became what was known as a Bible student in 1908, and she was converted by her father-in-law and his second wife. And at that time, the movement was far, far more liberal than it later became. After World War I, it began to become very authoritarian in outlook and has continued that way to the very present day. In fact, it's more severe and more authoritarian today than it ever was. The impact on young people in Jehovah's Witnesses is, in general, quite terrible. I can't give exact statistics because I don't think anyone has exact statistics. But from my studies, as a historian and someone who has taught religious studies at university level, my ready reckoning is that 50% of all of the children of Jehovah's Witnesses leave the movement because they simply cannot take the constant pressures that go on within the community. And one of the reasons for this is that there is a tremendous lack of understanding of how parents should relate to children, what the problems of children are, what the problems of teenagers in particular are. And there is an attempt to apply Victorian values to the young people at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. And it simply will not work. Very serious. One of the things that is wrong with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I might say that it's wrong with a great many other very strict fundamentalist religions, is that people are taught a party line. And that has been true in the past with some of the great religions too, such as the Catholic religion, Lutheranism, to a lesser extent Anglicanism, but it's been there, where young people have been taught out of a book, they've been taught cant answers, catechism learning. You are asked a question, you give an answer, and then you get out into the larger world and you discover that not only the answers, but often the questions were rather meaningless. And the problem is that within these very strict religious movements, people do not develop internal ethical and moral values. The values that they have are completely external. And then they begin to ask questions. Well, why? When they get to be teenagers and young adults, why do we do this way? Why? What are the reasons for? Well, don't ask me why. This is just the way it is. This is what someone in authority has said. And in the world in which we live, that's simply not good enough. And then frequently they will leave the religious movement, and since they have no internalized value system, they either explode or implode ethically and morally. And what I have seen is that so many of these young people will start engaging in illicit sex of all kinds, heterosexual, homosexual. They'll start trying drugs, tobacco. Alcohol is, of course, the prime favorite. On and on. And what you have then is young people who have no real internalized value system, and they simply go with the flow, and that can be incredibly destructive. Now, there are others who go out and they'll join another religious movement, or they'll go to university, and often what you get then is a real bitterness, feeling of anti-religiosity. All of those things come to the fore. So mindless religion, and there is so much of it around. And when I say that as a deeply religious Christian. There is so much of this mindless religion around which doesn't teach people to evaluate, to critique, to think, and to say, hey, I should do this because there are very good reasons, not because someone in some religious hierarchy has told me this is the way to go. And many of these strict religious groups have so many thou shalt nots, and many of the things that they teach really have very little to do with how one should live, how one should relate both to God and to one's neighbors. You know, much of the propositional theology that many of these religions teach has nothing to do with feeding starving children or caring for the lame, the halt, and the blind. It has everything to do with some kind of power trip that people up top take. And this is not one religion, this is many religions. And this often results in tremendous repression. Oh, you mustn't go to university. Or if you go to university, you've got to study a certain field, because if you study another field, you might be contaminated by evolution, or you might be contaminated by some other thought process, and on and on. You shouldn't dance. You mustn't touch alcohol. You mustn't do this. You mustn't do that. And it becomes a litany of thou shalt not. And what is so wrong about this is that unless there is something which is harmful to the self in a physical sense or harmful to the others, I would argue that a person is free to do what he or she chooses to do within the context of generally accepted good morals. And if you want to pursue a course in biology, or a course in music, or a course in art, if you want to study computing science or mathematics, God bless you. There's nothing wrong with these things. And all of these prohibitions are so contrary to good mental health, and I think they're contrary to the principles of positive Christianity. I have known literally hundreds of people who are suffering and have suffered terribly. And I often have people come to me and say, well, what's the use of my trying to do this or that? What's the use of my having a religious belief? I am so sinful that God couldn't save me, which is, of course, a very foolish thing to say, because if God is love, it's questioning the power and the love of God. And it's all right for one to question oneself, I guess, but why question the love of God? And I tell people this. I say, hey, you know, you are loved. God loves you, and there are others who love you. And love is what makes the world go round. And so get off this kick. Get off this kick of thinking that you're such and such, you're so evil, or that you're not worthwhile. After all, you are worthwhile. And the way that you become worthwhile is becoming worthwhile to others. If we love others, they will come to love us. There will be a response. Oh, in some cases that won't happen. There are some people, you know, who will reject anyone as they rejected Christ. But in general, there will be those who will respond positively. What makes a person a useful person is to be loved by his family, by his children, by his friends, by his neighbors. And that's what makes us worthwhile, not caterwauling about ourselves. There is, in this day and age, this whole business of, I'm going off to find myself. As a matter of fact, I hear that from a lot of women, and my response very often is, my goodness, I hope you don't find yourself, because what you will find is there's nothing there, and you may just decide to end it all. Ourselves are only important in relation to others, to God and our fellow human beings, and to the creation around us. That's what makes us meaningful persons. It's much, much more blessed to give than to receive. When we were living in Wisconsin years ago, and I was teaching at a university there, the University of Wisconsin, we were living in a small community just outside of Madison. And the neighbor was a Jehovah's Witness elder, and I was there, and we were raising our children as Jehovah's Witnesses. And at the time, we had I guess our daughter was about 4, and his son was about 6. And believe it or not, our 2 little kids went around the neighborhood and terrorized all the neighbor kids, because they told them that since they were not members of the right religion, they were going to be destroyed at Armageddon. Now, what a horrible thing, you know, and I had to laugh at it, but I was really pretty appalled, and I wondered what the neighbors thought. And you know, how contrary this is to the Christian message of the love of God. You know, Christianity is supposed to be the good news, and this was hardly the good news for anybody. I'll tell you what the situation was, and it became incredibly burdensome to me. I was an educated person within a community that was hostile towards advanced education. And it got so that time after time after time, I would be questioned and censored and criticized for saying something that someone didn't like. There was always some individual who wanted to teach me or felt that he had a right to teach me humility. And there were always a number of women who were constantly critical. There was a great deal, I think, of jealousy and perhaps a feeling of inferiority on the part of some people, because I've had other educated persons within the same community tell me exactly the same thing. And I know within Jehovah's Witnesses, if you were very wealthy, you tended to be looked down upon unless you subsidized some of the traveling overseers, and then you were a good fellow. If you were highly skilled, for instance, if you were a musician or an actor or something like that, if you let people know that, there was a great deal of clucking. If you were educated, went to university, taught in high school, there was a great deal of clucking about that. You always had to be watched as a danger to the community. And another group that suffered very, very much was if there were particularly young women who were outstandingly good looking, there would almost inevitably be a certain degree of jealousy directed towards them and an attempt to put these people down. In other words, what you have is a religion which is so immeasurably self-righteous that it's pharisaical. And this is so characteristic of so many of the fundamentalist religions and sectarian movements. They are so self-righteous, quite frankly, that they stink. They're so heavenly minded. They're so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. What you would get is elders in the congregation, traveling overseers, who would complain about children peeping in meetings, or babies crying, or something like this. And the meetings were incredibly long, 2-hour meetings often, and there were no Sunday schools or no separate places for children to go. And as a consequence, these poor little kids had to sit there, often on hard seats for 2 hours. And in one sense, some of the discipline was good, but it was too much. And some of these kids, of course, couldn't take it. They'd start to cry, they'd start to fuss, and as they got older, they'd like to play around. And there was a lack of any sense of humor. And the elders and traveling overseers in particular would get on the parents, and some of the parents would be very insensitive and wail the dickens out of the children. And I know that there were times that I was just horrified at the treatment of children, the severity of the treatment of children. It was the old idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, and children should be made to be quiet and listen, and the whole thing was, it seems to me, very destructive. And when you have a religion that doesn't recognize that children are children, this is pretty sick. One of the things that goes on with Jehovah's Witnesses is the extreme sexual Puritan nature of the movement. And I sat in on meetings as an elder myself at one time, And young couples would sometimes be brought in, and they had confessed to having had intercourse before they were married, or sometimes they would be discovered and dragged before what was called a judicial committee. And often the committees would question these young people, and sometimes the questions were way out of line. I remember myself asking a question, and another elder, and I have a great deal of respect for him to this very day, he's still one of Jehovah's Witnesses from what I know, said, well, you really have to ask that. And I thought right away, hey, you're right, I don't have to ask that, because that's very embarrassing to the young woman who was involved. But in some of these judicial committees, what will happen is, well, how did you get involved in the act? How far did he penetrate you? And questions such as this that had really nothing to do with much of anything. And can you imagine a young 15, 16-year-old girl being asked this by 40 and 50-year-old men? Just totally destructive. It's almost like psychological rape. And on another occasion, I remember I was acting as the presiding minister of the congregation, and a young couple had just moved into our congregation. And this evening after a meeting, he came up to me and he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, what do you need to talk to me about? And he said, well, can we go in the back room? And I said, sure. And his little wife followed him. He was about 18, 19, and she was about 17. And the story came out that he had been going up to northern Canada to work for a few months, and the night before he left, they became quite intimate and had sexual relations. And they felt terribly sinful about this and went and confessed their sins. They were then married 6 months later, but the elders insisted that they continued to report to the presiding minister of the congregation every month for a year or so after. And they came to me and told me this story, and I said, well, what can I do? You know, this was mind-bending to me even at the time. And I said, well, have you asked forgiveness? Yes. Do you believe that Christ has forgiven you? Yes. Well, if Christ has forgiven you, what can I do? And it soon became obvious that they were placing me in the position kind of a father confessor who had to impose on them some kind of penance, even though this was in a religion which supposedly didn't teach auricular confession. So I thought for a minute, and I said, well, here's what you do. You both go home, you kneel down beside the bed together, you thank God for the forgiveness that you have received, for the love that you have for one another, and then you go to bed and make love to one another. By this time, I was becoming totally fed up with the whole puritanical, Victorian, Pharisaical outlook on these matters. And while I think that premarital intercourse is not healthy or is not right from a Christian standpoint, at the same time, this fixation on these things and this feeling that you have to punish people is so unhealthy. Within the Catholic Church, if a person goes to confession, the priest imposes penance on him, but immediately gives absolution. Protestants have traditionally taught that you go to Christ and you leave your sins with Christ and they're forgiven if you're sincere. In both instances, sincerity is important. But with a group like Jehovah's Witnesses, there seems to be an additional matter of imposing more and more punishment until you're finally absolved of your sins. This is horrible. And I think that this goes back primarily to the second president of the Watchtower Society, Judge Joseph Franklin Rutherford, who really thought that he was the voice of God. I think the man was a psychologically very sick individual who hated almost everybody and probably hated himself in the long run. And had this idea. He came to the movement, a movement which taught that most of mankind was going to be saved. And by the time that he died, he taught that no one outside of the movement would be saved, and even those who would be saved would have to work like the dickens to be saved. And you know, it's such a violation of traditional Protestant values. It's such a violation of primitive Christian values, and the Catholic Church has never imposed this sort of thing on people. Well, the word discipline, to start out with that, the word discipline really means to train or to teach. Now, you may use punishment sometimes to teach people. Someone has done something bad, whether it's a child or an adult. We send people to prisons, and we hope, although I don't think we do a very good job of it, we hope that when they come out of prisons they will be reformed. The fact is, however, that discipline should not be primarily a matter of punishment. Some children need to be given pretty severe discipline because of their natures. They're ornery little cusses, so to speak. Other children, if you look at them crosswise, they break down and they cry. And you have to know, as a sensitive parent or a sensitive teacher or whoever it may be, how to discipline somebody. And there must be always, in disciplining, two qualities: justice and love. Children know when they're being treated unjustly. If they have done something wrong and they know that they're being punished for having done something wrong, they will accept that. But if they're punished unjustly or more severely than they deserve to be punished, they'll grow up resenting it. And there must always be love along with that. Now, we're all so terribly imperfect, and I've often thought that starting out as a parent when you're very young is somewhat unfortunate because you have so little training in being a parent. And most of us grow to be a little milder when we get older. But we need to learn that principle of recognizing that discipline is a matter of training people for life and for positive things. Punishment is sometimes necessary, but it should be the last resort always. Most children, I don't know about you or about many others, but when I was learning, whether it was in the grades or in high school or in university, if I had a teacher or an instructor who was kindly and approachable, I learned much better. I learned much better. And I've always felt that's the way to treat people. Like so many of my confreres, I became a bit self-righteous, and after all, we had been put through a lot of severe times, persecution and so forth, and you got to saying to yourself, boy, it'll be nice to see some of those individuals out there zapped. And you know, it was the sort of self-righteousness that comes from being a persecuted group. I've always thought how paradoxical that the Christian community, which was terribly persecuted by pagans and Jews during the first few hundred years of its existence, then, after it became the legalized religion in the Roman Empire, turned around and imposed terrible persecution on pagans and even worse on Jews for hundreds of years. The Puritans in England fled England and came to New England to escape religious persecution and turned around executing witches and hanging Quakers. The Jews in World War II suffered unbelievable agony. The Holocaust is one of the most awful blots in human history. And so what do the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust do but go over to Palestine and impose a terrible rule, a cruel and inexcusable rule on the Palestinians in Israel or Palestine, whatever one wants to call it today, the Middle East. And Jehovah's Witnesses, the treatment that that religion imposes on its own dissidents is absolutely horrifying. It seems that the persecuted become the persecutors. And it almost seems like an iron law. I'm sure that there are some people who escape this, but religious groups as a whole do not seem to escape it. Self-righteousness seems to be a terrible thing. And I admit fully that there were times when I said, well, these people have been mean to me, all of these Catholics and Protestants or whoever else that's out there, you know, and may the whole system go down at Armageddon, may God destroy them. I thank God that I've outgrown that, because I believe that there are many of those people out there who are now my brothers and sisters in Christ. And I go beyond that and say, hey, you know, there are a lot of people in other religious movements, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, so forth. I don't know who's going to be saved, who isn't. It's not my portfolio, but if God is love, He's going to extend a hand to the whole lot. And you see it in various fundamentalist religions, you know, the name it and claim it religions, the prosperity teaching, people running around the city and looking at other people's houses and saying, I'm going to live in that house because so-and-so is going to be zapped, he isn't a Christian or she isn't a Christian, and you get it within fundamentalism, where people use the word Christian not to mean Catholics, not to mean Anglicans, not to mean United Churchmen, and certainly not to mean Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and on, but a very narrow group of evangelical Christians who say, oh, we're Christians, and all the rest of you are not real Christians. You're just so-called Christians. And of course the sectarian movements do the same. And my reaction to this is, who made them Jesus Christ? You know, none of us were given that portfolio. I don't know who's going to be saved. I don't know who's going to be damned. I don't believe in hellfire. I think it's an awful religious doctrine. And quite frankly, I will stake my hopes on the love of God. Well, basically, I never felt compelled to accept all of the teachings and doctrines of the movement. I often said that within Jehovah's Witnesses there were Protestant and Catholic Jehovah's Witnesses. Protestant Jehovah's Witnesses said, well, what the Bible teaches is right, and if the Watchtower is in accord with the Bible, then we accept it. If not, we ignore it. Catholic Jehovah's Witnesses said, oh, this is God's holy organization. This is His ark. This is the channel. And you must accept everything that comes down from Brooklyn rather than Rome in this particular case. And I always questioned certain things. When I was a boy growing up, Jehovah's Witnesses taught that you shouldn't accept vaccination. Vaccination would give you all sorts of things, which you didn't want, including cancer and what all. And you shouldn't eat out of aluminum dishes. They were poisonous and so forth. And aluminum may be dangerous. Some people say it may have an impact on Alzheimer's, but those weren't the arguments that were presented in any case. And there was a lot of medical quackery that went on, things such as this. And over the years, there were numerous things that I questioned, although not very seriously. What really began to bother me was the incredible lockstep nonsense, the attempt to force you into a particular life mold. At one time in the early 1960s, I remember, everything was to be scheduled. You were to schedule every aspect of your life. Well, that's a bit much. You can't schedule every aspect of your life. And as time went by, the anti-intellectualism in the movement became much, much worse, and the treatment of people became incredibly severe. And then I began to witness numerous cases of what I considered to be terrible injustice. And then I saw, when my son went to university in the early 1970s, the boy was incredibly persecuted for going to university, and his in-laws made a terrible fuss about this. And ultimately, I got to feel that the religion had very little to do with positive Christianity, that there was a tremendous lack of love. To give you an example, we had a traveling supervisor, overseer, and this man came to the congregation, and within Jehovah's Witnesses, you're expected to report the time that you go from house to house preaching, or if you can't go from house to house, you talk to somebody and preach at them and try and convert them. And you're supposed to report this on what's called a time slip, or was then. And I remember this traveling overseer, and he came in and he was mocking people for not reporting enough of their time. And he said, I went into this congregation and the elders were trying to defend some people because and make excuses for people. And he said, for instance, there was one sister, and I said, where is Sister So-and-so's report for this month? She's irregular in service. And one of the elders said, oh, she had a baby. And this man, who was married but had never had chick nor child, said, well, what's so terrible about having a baby? So she had a baby. And he mocked her in this way. Well, anyone who has been a parent knows that when a woman gives birth to a child, her attention is fixed entirely on the birth and on the newborn child. That is her purpose in life at that given moment. She's a mother. She loves that baby, and she's thinking of that new life. But this character was mocking her because she hadn't taken time to preach to some of the nurses or the doctors or somebody and make her time report. It was all very mechanistic, had nothing to do with love or anything else. It had everything to do with this mechanistic, sacramentalized business of preaching. And I was so angered at this man, because by that time I was not only a father but a grandfather, and I leaned over to my wife and I said, I wish this man would give birth to a baby elephant. Maybe he'd know what it's all about. And it was that incredible insensitivity, that self-righteousness, that sickened me so much. And eventually I just couldn't keep still. I sent a letter to the headquarters of the movement in New York, and they turned on me like vipers. I complained over their false prophecies. I complained, but much more, I complained over this lockstep Pharisaical religious behavior, which has nothing to do with the love of Christ. And they did me a favor. They threw me out. Well, actually, I don't know whether they fired me or I quit. It all happened at the same time. But I'm so glad that I now have the freedom of Christ, and I can now love my neighbors without reserve. I don't care whether they're Catholics or Buddhists or Muslims or Jews or who they are. I can like them without judging them. And I like that. There is a feminine aspect, although I think that to a great extent the patriarchy has been misinterpreted by people who wanted to model themselves on the patriarchs, and by feminists who have made the word patriarch a dirty word in our day. Patriarchy has to do with fathers and children, not husbands and wives. And a patriarch, above all, And this is why we call God Father in the Lord's Prayer. A patriarch, above all, should be a provider, a protector, a lover, a nurturer. You know, we fathers in the Western world don't spend enough time nurturing our kids. My son-in-law has a poem on his computer, and I took a peek at it. A little over a year ago, my daughter lost a baby at birth, and he had this poem about how fathers had to be hard. They had to put up a front, how he had to be strong, how he had to wipe the tears from her eyes. But the poem ended with the words, "I lost my baby too. I lost my baby too." We as men are capable of all of the passions, all of the feelings, all of the love that women are. We're different. Thank God we're different. They're our compliments and we're their compliments. But we're capable of those same deep, warm emotions. And we need to manifest those. We need to be loving. We need to be kind. We need to extend ourselves. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's hard. But it is something that we need to learn. And many of the religions in our day and age, for political reasons, for power trip reasons, for traditions, for self-righteousness, for all of these things, are the greatest bars to us being true human beings in the image and likeness of the gentle Jesus. And that's what we need to be. We need to model ourselves on that man. I'm still working at it. I've got an awful long way to go.
I think we all have.
Although I can tell you one thing, they nearly destroyed my health. I can tell you this, my experience in leaving the Watchtower Society, Jehovah's Witnesses, was an incredibly difficult one. Not difficult in the sense that I felt that I was losing prospects of life, because by that time I had come to feel that this organization had so very little to do with Christianity, with positive Christianity. And over the years I've come to feel even more strongly that that's the case. But I had loved so many people in the community. I saw people whom I had loved, whom I would give my life for, turn on me like vipers. I saw others who I didn't think would come forward and give me support do so. And I thank God for those persons, and I love them very much to this day. Over 80 of us left at one time in Lethbridge. And Andrew, you were one down here in Ontario. So there were others in other places as well. The agony of being torn out of a community was very painful to me, and very painful to me to see the anger, the hostility, the judgmentalness. And I reacted with anger and hurt. And shortly thereafter, I suffered 2 heart attacks. And at the time, I began to feel real terrible abdominal pains. And I went to see my doctor about them as well, and he said, "Well, we'll check you out." And they did, and he said, "You know, your large intestine, the descending colon, is just filled with hundreds of pockets of diverticuli." And he said, "What has happened to you," this was his diagnosis, not mine, "is that you have been under such incredible strain that it's just literally torn your intestine." And eventually, several years later, I couldn't put up with it anymore. I was in constant pain, and I had to go and have a bowel resection and a large segment of my large intestine removed. And the effect on my health, and I'm sure the length of lifespan has been cut down by this. And you know, it would be very easy for me to be incredibly bitter. And I have to admit that I'm very critical of the religion and very critical of the tack that it takes. But may God have mercy on the individuals and bring them to the joy and Christian freedom that I have. And you know, if any of these people were to turn around and come forward and say, hey Jim, we want to shake your hand, I would say, God bless you. And thousands upon thousands of people who have left Jehovah's Witnesses and other tight religious groups have had their physical health destroyed. Many of them have had their mental health destroyed. Many of them have had their spiritual health destroyed. Many of them simply find it impossible to overcome the experiences that they've had. Many of them go on for 20 years with the deepest hurt and the deepest bitterness. And it's a horrible thing when a religion which claims to be of the God of love, when it does this to people. It's so awful. And of course it's the Pharisaism of the 20th and 21st centuries. Very few psychiatrists or psychologists are aware of this. I really think that many of the people who have developed the psychological model of cults are misguided. I think that Margaret Singer, for instance, has inappropriately used the sources that she claims to have used for developing her model of cults and brainwashing and all this sort of thing. I think we're dealing with something much more significant, much broader. Most people who are Jehovah's Witnesses, most people who are fundamentalist Christians of various sorts belonging to sects and so-called cults, they're there because they want to be there.
That's right.
And you know, many people like to blame these organizations for what they have experienced. But, you know, when I reached a point where I said I have to leave, I left. And thousands of others have done the same. And, you know, we still have freedom of religion. These religions, as long as they don't do something physically harmful to people, they should be left alone. There is the question of children, of course, and this is a very serious matter. But the problem is that the state, the secular state, is no better and no wiser than many of these religions. And that was proven very, very dramatically in the Soviet Union. It was proven very dramatically in Nazi Germany. And to a lesser extent, it was proven in countries like the United States and Canada. The secular state should, to the greatest degree possible, stay out of religious affairs. Those of us who know religions intimately and know what's wrong with them should be doing just exactly what you're doing, Andrew, and that is putting the spotlight on them, looking at these things, educating people, and bringing people to a greater knowledge. Now, some people will remain fools because they want to be fools. And, you know, you can lead a fool to school, but you cannot make him think. And so we have to leave those people to their own fate and to the judgment of God. But insofar as any form of coercion is concerned, no. And I think that, unfortunately, both the psychiatric and psychological disciplines are far from understanding the impact of tight religious groups. An awful lot more work needs to be done.
Excellent.
I'm working on Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich. And the story there is a pretty perverted one. The witnesses have claimed that they alone stood up to Hitler when there is abundant evidence, number one, that they tried to get in bed with Hitler in 1933. They were prepared to stop the preaching work in Germany in order to obtain properties. They have denied being anti-Semitic. There's clear evidence that they were anti-Semitic at the time. All of these things are coming out, and I'm going to bring them out in a forceful way. Another thing, of course, is that it's now pretty evident that the Watchtower Society in New York drove the ordinary German Jehovah's Witnesses into martyrdom by doing things that were incredibly foolish. And had they showed more restraint, I'm not suggesting that they should have compromised with Nazism, not at all, but had they shown more restraint and good sense, far fewer of them would have died in Hitler's prisons and concentration camps.